Hey everyone, my name is Dan and I make competitive Warhammer 40k content. Today we're going to be trying to answer the question, is Warhammer 40k a bad game? Now, it sounds a little bit clickbaity, so I want to just clarify. This is not about if Warhammer 40k is unbalanced, it's not about if the meta is bad or recent rule changes. My goal is to make content about Warhammer 40k that is evergreen and teach us kind of like how to think about Warhammer 40k as well as games in general. So today we're actually going to be talking about the mechanics and game design in Warhammer 40k and how some of those kind of what I would consider poor game design decisions leads to an inherently imbalanced match and sometimes unfun gameplay. There's a saying that the day people stop bringing you problems is the day they've lost trust in you. So I say these things about the game because I know we can make them better over time. In my opinion, Games Workshop makes the best models in the mini-sphere. Additionally, they have an incredible lore that backs up their game. However, I think there's a lot of improvements they could make to game design to lead to more fun games. Also, looking at these game mechanics helps us to understand what is good and why certain things are good in the game. I've played dozens of other miniature games and hundreds of board games, and I really like talking about different game mechanics. First, we have to define a few terms. The first one we're going to be looking at is the term simplicity. So any game is going to exist on a spectrum between incredibly simple and trivial to learn, all the way up to increasingly complex. And that spectrum basically boils down to how hard is this game to pick up and play. The other term we'll be using is strategic depth. A game with strategic depth is determined through many options with meaningful impacts. In other words, how obvious is it to find the right answer or most optimal play? Every decision should have some type of, benefit and drawback to it. There should be counterplay between your opponent, things like that. Now, on the other side of strategic depth is a game with kind of just a random chance. Now, it's important to caveat that some games, the skill is actually mitigating, that random chance. So, for example, a game like poker still requires skill and strategic depth, even though it comes down to essentially a random chance of who has the better hand when they win. Okay, and we can put this on kind of an XY scale, and we can plot different games. So when we look at board games in general, it's important to know that simple does not mean a lack of complexity. In fact, I would argue that chess, for example, is a very easy game to learn, but in order to get the optimal play, you essentially need to be, a supercomputer. So I would say chess is very simple, but has a lot of strategic depth. And then we have another game, like a casino game, like roulette, which is essentially very easy to learn. You just roll a couple dice and you either win or you lose. But the strategic depth of it is non-existent. It's totally a random chance. So these are kind of two extremes. But it's important to know that complexity and strategic depth are not always tied together, and we don't have to have a very complex game if we want to have a strategically deep game. Then we have a game like Catan, which I would argue is very close to the center. Pretty easy game to pick up, but also has just a little bit of kind of strategic play. It's very good as a beginner game because of that. So my question to you is, where do you think Warhammer 40k 9th edition is? Well, I would actually put it pretty far in the complexity side, and then kind of medium in the strategic depth. I think that unfortunately Games Workshop has conflated complexity and strategic depth, and they have a set of rules that is far too complex without actually adding any interesting gameplay. A couple examples of Warhammer 40k being far too complex for its own good. The first one is terrain rules. It's multiple pages that could probably be boiled down to, honestly, a couple sentences. Ruins, +1 saves, you can't see through. And then you have forests. You can see through, -1 to hit. -2 movement if you move through. Done. That would honestly work for almost every single game of Warhammer 40k and reduce about 95% of the text on their rules page. Additionally, Games Workshop has like an aversion to using universal rules, and a lack of universal rules causes the community to have to come up with them ourselves. Name one model that actually has the deep strike keyword or feel no pain. Most of them actually don't. We kind of created those universal rules to explain different things that units have, but those aren't actually called that on their data sheets. So just basic things like that seem to be adding complexity to the rule system without adding any strategic value to the game. Now for the grognards out there, I will say that Warhammer 40k 7th edition and some of those older versions were even more complex and had a little more strategic depth. Now, they had things like where facing mattered, guessing distances, all these other type of things. And 7th edition was also probably too complex. And so when they moved from 7th to 9th, they took away a little bit of the complexity and a little bit of the strategic depth. I think they made a better game, but I think there's a lot more we could do to make Warhammer 40k better. So for the rest of the video, we're going to be talking about different ways that we can increase the strategic depth of Warhammer 40k and why some of the game design elements kind of hinder our ability to do that. And if you're interested in these topics and you want to talk to me more about it, I highly encourage you to sign up my Patreon, support me, and then come join us on Discord where we can talk about these things more together. I just want to once more thank all my Patreons for their support. Plus, you see the videos a day early with no ads if that's something you're interested in. So one of the core mechanics of Warhammer 40k is the D6 mechanic. One thing that's important to know about the D6 mechanic is it has very little granularity. If we compare a D6 to a D20, you can see that you've got a lot more leeway in terms of buffs. Going from a 3+ to a 4+ to hit is massive. Going from a 11 to a 12 on a 20-sided dice is much smaller. So we actually have a lot less design space in how we can change the modifiers and things like that with a D6. Most dice also have a binary result. For example, if we're rolling to hit, you either hit or you miss. There's no kind of shades of gray in between that. Of course, there are some units that say when they get a 6 to hit, they get an additional hit, etc. But Games Workshop actually has to kind of move away from that because if you're rolling 30 dice and, a 4 does this, a 5 does this, but you re-roll 2s, it would add so much more time to the re-rolling and actually kind of sorting of dice that they try to kind of go away from that. But it's not just the D6s, it's also how we roll them. Because we have this binary hit or miss, we can break down very easily each dice into kind of a percentage of success. For example, if you hit on a 4, 5, or 6, that is a 50% chance of succeeding in that roll. And then we have a wound and then a failed save. And because each of these die rolls are independent and have a binary state, we can very easily multiply the chance of a hit turning into a failed save by just multiplying the chance to hit, the chance to wound, and the chance to fail a save. Now this is in stark contrast to a different kind of game mechanic like War Machine, which I'll call comparing towers. So the idea is the active player rolls a couple dice, for example, they get some value, they subtract the armor value of the opponent, and then they do that much damage. So you're kind of comparing the value of your damage to the value of their armor, and then the excess goes through. So if I add modifiers to that War Machine kind of damage tower, you will see that the damage will increase linearly. +1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, if you put it on a chart, it would increase linearly. Now in Warhammer 40k, the probabilities are actually multiplied together, so buffs in 40k are actually multiplicative. And you can see this example best in my Warhammer 40k Beginner's Dice Math video, where we looked at kind of pre-9th edition Thousand Suns, and we could see that we could make a unit of Terminators do 4.5 times their normal amount of damage by stacking buffs on them. That's because the buffs are multiplicative. And this game mechanic inherently makes it much better to stack buffs on one large unit. So when we talk about strategic depth, it very often comes down to putting all of your buffs on one massive unit and blowing away, your opponent's army. Now, I don't think Games Workshop is ever going to go away from their kind of patented dice mechanic system, and that's okay, but it's important for us to understand the importance that puts on buffs and kind of the lack of design space it puts because of the granularity of the D6 mechanic. This next issue is based on a bunch of different game mechanics. So now we're going to be talking about why the turn 1 player has an advantage in 40k, and it comes down to the turn mechanics, the threat ranges, and the board size. So we're going to be using a term here called the FAO, or the first attack opportunity. This term is used to describe between two units who is going to get the first opportunity to attack the other. Now, it's a video game, but if we look at Civilization 6, we can see that different units all have, a little bit of movement and then some range. Because of the mechanics in Civilization 6, if you have an archer unit and a spearman, It doesn't matter whose turn it is, the archer will always be able to shoot the spearman because of the way the line of sight works. Essentially, the spearman moves up, the archer shoots them. Or if the spearman stays back, the archer moves up and then shoots them. So the first attack opportunity is always given to the archer. What gives the first attack opportunity to someone in Warhammer 40k? Warhammer 40k has a phased-based I go, you go system. That means you go through all the phases of the entire game with all of your models, and then your opponent goes through all the phases of all of their models. And this is in stark contrast to a game like Malifaux, for example, which has alternating activations. I do one unit, you do one unit, and we go back and forth until everybody's done. A lot of people would call 12 to 18 inches kind of like a low threat range of a weapon, but it actually usually can just do the job and still allow you to attack first. The distance between deployment zones in a game of 40k goes between 18 and 24 inches, so a model with an 18-inch gun and 6 inches of movement can actually go from your deployment zone to reaching out and hitting things in your opponent's deployment zone on turn 1. And this probably wouldn't be that much of an issue if we did alternating activations, but because a unit that's dead can't attack back, if you can go first and kill a third of your opponent's army, they're going to be much, much weaker on the swing back. Because it would be so easy to just, reach out and kill your opponent's army on turn 1, we have to add huge amounts of terrain in 9th edition. Terrain in 9th edition is so incredibly important because it's used to mitigate this turn 1 advantage. And if you don't believe me, imagine how a game would play out if you were going second with bad terrain, not just no terrain, but just bad terrain against a AdMech gun line. You would be absolutely obliterated. So the turn mechanics plus threat ranges plus the board size gives us a very tenuous relationship with terrain. If you put too little terrain on the board, the turn 1 player has a massive advantage. And Games Workshop understands that the turn 1 player has an inherent advantage, and they give a scoring benefit to the second player in primaries. Additionally, many secondaries are much better and easier to score if you're the second player. So because of this turn 1 advantage, we have to give victory point bonuses to the turn 2 player. And this exacerbates our terrain issue. Too little terrain, turn 1 player has a massive advantage. Too much terrain, the turn 2 player now has an advantage. And this all comes back to the issue that the first attack opportunity is not always given to the unit with the longer threat range, but rather it's usually a combination of the terrain and who's the first turn player. Another issue that 40k has is a lack of off-turn interaction. In other words, when it's not your turn, there's very little for you to do, very little meaningful impacts. I would say in most of my games, I could look at my opponent and say, hey, whenever that unit shoots this unit, I'm going to use transhuman. And then I could walk away for 30 minutes and come back. It doesn't matter who rolls the armor saves, so they could just roll my armor saves for me. I don't need to be there, and I just come back and play my turn. And that lack of off-turn interaction wouldn't even be that bad if the turns were shorter or you did alternating activations. But these turns can be wicked long, lasting up to like 30 minutes. It means a lot of times you just kind of sit there awkwardly watching your opponent pick up all your models. So it's okay to do this I go, you go phase-based activation, but I think we need to give much more for us to do when it's not our turn. Now, I think we all understand that there's already too many stratagems in the game, but I think many of them could be converted into kind of your turn or your opponent's turn stratagems to give you things to do. And we'll talk more about how we can add some off-turn interaction when we start to talk more about game mechanics. So every army in 40k has a specific game mechanic or kind of synergy that their army has. The Space Marine mechanic is called Doctrines. Essentially, turn 1, their heavy weapons get an additional armor piercing value. Turn 2, it's the rapid fire weapons. And turn 3, it's close combat weapons. Additionally, they can reroll morale tests, and you get to pick a subfaction. For example, if I play Blood Angels, I get +1 to wound in melee, and I get +1 to my advances and charges. The final benefit for being Blood Angels is that when I'm in that close combat doctrine, I actually get an additional attack. Now, I was very surprised because I put a poll out where I asked you, hey, tell me about your favorite army mechanics, and a lot of people actually said the Space Marine Doctrines, and I thought that was odd because I find these incredibly kind of lazy and boring. So what does this mechanic boil down to? Well, by doing nothing, you just get kind of a flat increase to certain damages. When I think about Blood Angels, I think about jump packs and vampires and Death Company and all these awesome, cool things associated with their lore, but their rules essentially boil down to a flat increase in melee damage. So besides pushing me towards a close combat Space Marine army, what does this actually change about my list construction? Basically nothing. How does my opponent counterplay me? Kill my models? Is there anything I should do differently? I guess wait till turn 3 to attack in melee, but I've got so many ways to get into combat doctrine that it doesn't actually matter. Now, I want to compare this with a different game and kind of look at what the game mechanics in Synergy could be. So these models all come from a game called War Machine and Hordes. Specifically, these are based off of the Scorn faction in Hordes. And what I'm going to show you is kind of the equivalent of maybe a 700 point list. So in Hordes, you have what's called a Warlock. This is kind of like your leader or your king piece in chess. If he dies, the game is over. And then you have what's called War Beasts. Each of these has a resource called Fury that they generate whenever they make attacks and do stronger attacks. At the beginning of your turn, you pull back this Fury to your Warlock to cast spells. So in other words, your beasts are generating a resource that you pull back and spend on your Warlock. But if you generate too much Fury, your beast can go crazy. Additionally, every War Beast has a spell that they give your Warlock access to. And then we have a combination of living models and constructs. Now when these living models die, each of them will give up a soul that is taken to this construct solo. And then that character can use these souls to buff itself as well as nearby constructs. And then we kind of have these slave drivers in the middle, and they've got these whips that actually change the fury value on all the beasts. They also can make the beast stronger and charge and do all these types of things. And then on the bottom, you have two different types of basilisks. One is a female that can gaze at their opponent and paralyze them, and the other one is a melee beatstick that actually gets stronger when he's next to the female. Here's a few more. The Cyclops guy with the shield can take shots for your Warlock. The Warlock has spells that put buffs on living models. One of the buffs actually makes it so when those living models die in your opponent's turn, they get to move and make an attack. So your opponent has to be worried about killing something that goes and attacks one of your models that hasn't activated. And then these big guys with the spears and flags, when they attack, they actually throw their spear and can pull somebody into close combat. And that makes it so your constructs, who are kind of slow moving, can get these charges off. When we put this all together, we can see that we get this beautiful kind of complexity of choices that we have as an opponent. We want to kill certain beasts to reduce the fury aspect the Warlock has. We want to kill this, key piece of slave drivers in the middle to stop buffing the beasts. We probably want to kill the constructs before the guys who give souls. And we also have to be very careful about the order in which we attack, because if we kill one of those living models, it gets to move and attack and maybe even pull us out of position. So I want you to look at this together and ask yourself, does your Warhammer 40k army have even close to this amount of strategic depth or synergy? Or does your army mechanic essentially boil down to you get a straight buff to damage? And to top it off, this is the equivalent of maybe like 700 points. You would probably have about 3 times as many models compared to this in an actual 2,000 point competitive equivalent game. Now, Games Workshop has been making better mechanics, I will give them that. Cabal Points are the step in the right direction. So Cabal Points are a step in the right direction for Thousand Sons, and I know that Games Workshop is trying to make more interesting mechanics, but they are still far behind many other games in terms of synergy and counterplay within an army. So these Cabal Points are essentially a resource that is generated by all of your Thousand Sons units, and then can be spent by all of your Thousand Sons units. And then you have some generic Chaos units, like, these Mauler Fiends or Forge Fiends or whatever, that are kind of more just like Chaos agnostic, and they get no Cabal Points and they spend no Cabal Points. But the Cabal Points are very closed off. It just, all these guys generate all these points and then they spend all these points. How do you, as an opponent, truly go after this? What is the key part of this synergy that you take out? And the answer is there isn't one. And you can spend these Cabal Points to do certain buffs. Perhaps you increase the mortal wound damage output of some of your weapons, or make a spell autocast. And even that kind of boils down to, essentially an increase in damage percentage. Why can't we use Cabal Points to be teleporting things, moving our guys, giving, minuses to your opponent in their turn, moving their guys? So I'm going to share with you kind of an example mechanic I would make for Warhammer 40k. And this is going to be based off of Dark Eldar. Now I know Dark Eldar are kind of overpowered right now, but just take this with a grain of salt in terms of, is this an interesting mechanic? So in an ideal world, the army mechanics create kind of an asymmetric game where every time you play against a different army, they're trying to win in slightly different ways and you're trying to win in slightly different ways. Now I really like how Games Workshop tried to do this with faction-specific secondaries. And what I mean by that is the secondaries gave you a way to play that was different and unique to your faction. I do think many of them are inherently flawed and way too easy, but that's a story for a different day. There were two secondaries that really pushed kind of the direction Games Workshop wanted Dark Eldar to go in. The first of which is Fear and Terror, and this essentially got victory points for your opponent fleeing. The second one is Herd the Prey, which got you victory points for every quarter your opponent wasn't in. So now let's turn these into an actual resource that our faction can use. We'll call them fear points. So we'll say we generate these points whenever an enemy fails morale. And maybe we get fear points for every quarter your opponent isn't in at the beginning of your turn. And then also we'll throw in that you get points every time you kill an enemy character. And now you can see that this mechanic pushes you towards actually hurting your prey, not just for victory points, but as an actual army mechanic. Your opponent has all this counterplay when it comes to movement in their turn. And we're making it more flavorful about this whole stalking their prey and enemy failing morale. And then maybe our characters can spend these fear points, something like, call it Mirage. A friendly unit can move 2 inches when they're charged, so now we've got a little bit of counterplay in our opponent's turn. Maybe another one is called Ghost, and that makes it so all dice modifiers on an opponent's attacks are ignored. Maybe we have some movement we can do, like tentacles in the dark. We can use that in our command phase to move an opponent 2 inches closer to us. Or we could do mortal wounds to characters in line of sight. Now we have a resource generation mechanic with some counterplay, and an interesting way to spend them that affects the game and gives us things to do in our opponent's turn. Now we'll add a different mechanic with some keywords. We'll call it, Poison Mark and Hunters. So we'll give Dark Eldar troops this Poison Mark keyword, and maybe their squad leader is able to sacrifice their attack to instead mark an opponent. Kind of think of it like Tau marker lights, but not totally useless. So they give up their one attack, they shoot, if they hit, then they put this poison mark on the enemy. That enemy gets -1 to movement and is considered marked. That enemy can spend their activation to remove that mark. So we got a little bit of counterplay, and it incentivizes us to take actual troops. Then a different half of the Dark Eldar faction would have this Hunter keyword. Maybe they all inherently get a +1 inch to charging a marked unit, and then each has a unit-specific buff of when they actually attack a marked unit. And now there's synergy between these two keywords. Let's add just a little more fun. Maybe we have a kind of like a garrote line that goes between two different types of hover bikes on Dark Eldar. And if they charge anyone on the same turn, everyone between them gets hit. So now we have some positional gameplay. This is what I'd like to see every faction have in 40k. There needs to be far more counterplay, things to do in your opponent's turn, and synergy between our units. So be honest with me in the comments, would you prefer a mechanic like this, or do you just want combat drugs that say every turn you get some random benefit? If your mechanic benefits you to do the thing you're already going to do, it does not change your gameplay. Turn 1, getting hurt less, and turn 2, having a better chance to charge, is exactly what you were already going to do, and it's uninteresting. I got another couple fast ones here. Command points. So one of the issues with command points, which is, kind of this resource that Warhammer 40k uses, is that it's almost entirely front-loaded. And because we have this massive, turn 1 advantage where you want to kill your opponent before they kill you, it's almost always better to spend all of your command points on like turn 1 and turn 2. There's also an incredible amount of useless stratagems. Blood Angels have access to 50 stratagems, and I would say I probably use 3 to 4 of them per game. I would say cutting out 80% of the stratagems and replacing them with actual impactful and useful stratagems would be a far better way. Additionally, I'd like to see command points go to an every turn thing that's generated by your army. So instead of starting with 12 and generating 1 point a turn, What I like to see that go down to is generating 3 or 4 points a turn based on army construction. Many of these stratagems are often so important for a unit that they kind of become that unit's identity. And if you're going to use a single stratagem on a unit every single turn, it might as well just be part of their rules. It kind of reminds me of StarCraft 1, where we have these siege tanks that had to research a technology in order to be able to go into siege mode. And I think somewhere between that and StarCraft 2, the developers were like, why do we have to research a technology to make a siege tank go in siege mode? And they just changed it so you automatically start with it. I feel like we're at that point with a lot of different 40k units as well. The final thing I wanted to talk about is kind of list rules. Unfortunately, one of the things I think Games Workshop does is they use the "because I'm your boss" excuse. So why do you take troops in your army? Well, because Games Workshop says I have to have a legal list. Because there's no synergy within an army, you're almost always better off just taking the best unit as many times as you can. And there was a GT that was actually won at the beginning of turn 1 because the guy had 5 orc flyers that flew into his opponent's turn and killed everything. There's 2 ways we could try to fix this. One thing we could do is we could knock down the power of the orc flyers and then give an orc player a reason to take other units and maybe take their troops based on some type of synergy within their army. But instead, Games Workshop does what I call the "because I'm your boss" strategy, or "because I'm your mom." And they said you can only take now 2 flyers. So the fact that Games Workshop has to require certain units to be taken and limit other units to be taken is evidence of their bad game design. Because in an ideal world, you give people a reason to take troops. You don't have to force them. And you give people a reason to take a balanced army, not just take whatever does the most damage. So these fixes are essentially a band-aid when the real problem is a lack of synergy within an army. So that was a discussion on Games Workshop game mechanics. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a wonderful day.